Well, here's the real question. Are you guys dyeing eggs for Easter?
No.
Or with kids? With any kids? Wow.
No.
My girlfriend and I walked by a house in our neighborhood the other day where the kids were selling wooden eggs that were painted. I was
really?
This is a recession indicator.
That's good.
I drew a picture of an egg last week, a drawing.
Oh, that's nice. So you can just think about that.
Exactly.
On
I can
Easter.
Just imagine the drawing of the egg that I doodled on a piece of paper.
Gather around, my grandchildren. Let me tell you about when we had eggs.
All right. It's not Easter, or unless you're listening to this on Sunday, in which case, happy Easter. But either way, it's time for Sound Politics. You're listening to Sound Politics. Libby's out this week. I'm Scott Greenstone, KUOW's politics reporter. And as my colleagues at KUOW and I came to work yesterday and prepared to cross the street, pressing the crosswalk button on University Way, here's what we heard.
Hi, I'm Jeff Bezos. This crosswalk is sponsored by Amazon Prime with an important message. Please don't tax the rich. Otherwise, all the other billionaires will move to Florida, too. Wouldn't it be terrible if all the rich people left Seattle or got Luigi'd and then normal people could afford to live here again?
Just to be clear, that is not Jeff Bezos, and Amazon Prime did not sponsor the crosswalk outside our station. It's a hack, our colleague Monica Nicholsberg reported, and it's happened at a number of crosswalks across the city, and not just here, in the Bay Area. Street crossers heard AI Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. Not clear how connected all those are, but in case you are wondering, yes, the reference to Luigi Mangione is a threat, and yes, Seattle Department of Transportation chided whoever did this with a reminder that crosswalk audio is for blind folks crossing the street. But I bring this up because here, this crosswalk hack comes in the middle of a street fight over taxing people like Jeff Bezos, if he still lived here. The real one I'm talking about, not the AI crosswalk one. The last few weeks have seen on one side big business lobbying on the airwaves, Microsoft's president calling governors, and on the other, unions marching into the governor's office, including the head of the state employees union, who called the governor a rat fink. Joining us today to talk about what a rat fink even is and the Democratic Party's civil war over taxes is Seattle Times politics reporter Jim Brunner. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Scott.
And our own Olympia correspondent, Jeanie Lindsay. Hey, Jeanie.
Howdy.
So, Jeanie, I'm going to start with you. Different taxes on different groups or businesses or whatever have come up and been put down or shrunken or discarded for the moment or brought back. Can you bring us up to the moment? Like, what taxes are probably happening? Or at least, do the Democrats say, here's what we got now in this moment?
Yeah, they sent out a press release this week announcing sort of their slate of tax proposals that they say they found agreement on between the House and the Senate. It sort of aligns philosophically with what they've been saying in a lot of ways as far as targeting wealthier people and businesses, but doing it in a different method, I guess, than what they had initially proposed. So they're talking about increasing business tax rates for certain types of businesses, especially wealthier companies. They're talking about expanding the state's existing capital gains tax, particularly on the higher end, and also making changes to the estate tax. They're also talking about property tax reform and changing the cap for local government property tax collections. And that's something that local governments have been asking for a really long time. And that could lead to higher property tax bills for people. They're also making some changes to sales tax, including some new sales tax on like digital and like tech stuff, and then closing some various exemptions, tax exemptions. So sort of a smorgasbord, if you will, of different existing tax changes instead of proposing some big new stuff like they had originally proposed.
Yeah, smorgasbord. Is that how you see it, Jim?
Yeah, I think that the legislative Democrats have said that Bob Ferguson, the governor, removed some of their meal options here from the menu.
Okay.
Ferguson came out pretty strongly publicly a while ago against the wealth tax. I wrote about recently, there's been, of course, a big lobbying campaign, unsurprisingly, from some of the state's biggest companies, led by Microsoft. Jay Inslee, the former governor, supported the wealth tax when he put out kind of a lame duck budget in December.
Right. He was
on his way out the door.
Yeah.
And it came as a surprise, I think, to Microsoft President Brad Smith. He told me that Jay called him and gave him a heads up, and that his response was, "What are you doing to us?" And so that's kind of led to this lobbying effort where Microsoft and other businesses put together a PAC. They've had a bunch of ads everywhere. And they've also pledged $1 million toward a ballot fight if it comes to that. But so far, it looks like at least the legislature isn't going to move ahead with the wealth tax or this payroll tax that Microsoft also objected to, which is similar to Seattle's Jumpstart tax.
Yeah. So it really mobilized the business community is what you wrote about in the Seattle Times this week.
Yeah, and the legislative Democrats have said, kind of bowed to the argument so far that Ferguson has made, which is that even if you like the idea of the wealth tax, he's argued you can't rely on it in a budget crunch because it'll get immediately legally challenged. It's also a new tax. There could be some administrative issues similar with the payroll tax. Payroll tax has been upheld in court, in the Seattle payroll tax, but it would be a new tax statewide. So he was saying you can't really rely on these particular measures. And Bob Ferguson generally has been more on the let's find some cuts and efficiencies, as he puts it, in state government without going immediately to just raising taxes by many billions of dollars.
Okay, so on the one side, you have Brad Smith and the Microsoft people and the tech and the business money, right, mobilizing. On the other side, that has been pushing for, a wealth tax. And again, the wealth tax does not appear to be on the table, so these folks are probably kind of disappointed, I assume, now. But Jeanie, can you talk about the unions, particularly the state employee unions? Because that's the other big node of power or pole of power if you think about the Democratic Party in the state as like two poles, the one being business money and the other one being labor money. What has labor been doing to try and keep the wealth tax alive and the payroll tax?
I mean, they've been telling people about how mad they are.
Yeah.
The Washington, state employees union showed up here at the Capitol. I think it was last week, and they were knocking on the door of the governor's office, inviting Governor Bob Ferguson to come out and talk with them about it. Because
and they got in at one point, right?
They
got
did,
inside the
later.
office.
Yeah, later the doors opened up and they were, I think, having a chat with his interim chief of staff person. I wasn't there at the time. When I was up there, the door was still closed and they were yelling all kinds of stuff. But they're upset. And I think part of it is not just because of the cold water on the wealth tax that Governor Ferguson has been doing, but also the fact that it's been coupled with, hey, maybe we should furlough state employees. And so, state employees collectively bargained for increases to their compensation. And they said that they've been waiting a really long time for those types of increases. And so to not only have the governor come out and say no to the wealth tax and also furloughs for state employees to save the state money, it, I think, just really pissed them off. And so they've really been vocal about their opposition to that and just their calls for more taxes on wealthier folks because of the state's tax code relying so much on sales tax and all of the constraints around, graduated taxes for wealthier people.
Part of that being mad was the president of the State Employees Union, Mike Yastrzemski, told you, Jim, that the governor is a rat fink. What is a rat fink? Can you tell me?
Basically, he said that he felt betrayed. And he posted the rat fink comment, I think, on social media. But he followed up with an explanation when I interviewed him. And, his beef was that Ferguson, at that point, had not sat down personally with the State Employees Union reps. I think more recently, Ferguson may have met with some of the reps. But at that point, he hadn't. And, there was sort of a idea, at least as Yastrzemski put it, that Ferguson had relied on their support in the election, and then now he wouldn't meet with them personally. And Yastrzemski did say, look, I understand politics. I understand that maybe he's not going to take our position, but he should at least meet with us face to face. So that was sort of the anger part. Of course, he's engaging in a lobbying campaign and trying to move the needle on furloughs too with these public statements.
Yeah, Ferguson, he really did rise to power with the support of the progressive wing, and now they do feel, I think, kind of betrayed now that he's there, and they're like, wait, you're not acting like we thought you would. So if we talk about these two camps, right, in the Democratic Party, and we are talking about the two biggest funders of the elections, I mean, Yastrzemski and Wolfsey and their PAC, they are one of the biggest funders of, if not the biggest funder of Democrats in the legislature. And then you also have Microsoft and the tech and business money. Are these fault lines in the party new, or is this a rerun of multiple income tax fights or other tax fights over the years? Open question to either of you.
I mean, it's gotten more heated recently on the business side. And I'll say that the argument from the business side is, of course, they don't want to pay the taxes, but they do make an argument that, look, state government is still going to grow. Its revenues are still projected to grow substantially, even if you don't add any new taxes. And the second point that they make is that, look, we have supported, to some extent, not all businesses. There are some businesses who are kind of reflexively anti-tax all the time.
Yeah.
Microsoft has not always been that way. Microsoft has supported certain taxes. They've, as Brad Smith said, stayed on the sidelines of the capital gains fight last year, put $1 million into supporting the Climate Commitment Act. And they feel like one argument they're making now is that, look, the state's put all this money into schools, into homelessness, into housing, and you're not really seeing the type of results that you might want if you were grading them. And so they're, one of the arguments is we've supported some of these Democratic policies and they haven't produced results.
Progressives have said we need progressive revenue. And there's kind of a lot of what I would not call, sales taxes and property taxes tend to fall heavier on the lower and middle class. That's not a progressive revenue as far as I understand it. But Jim, I'm curious. So Democrats are opting for a lot of small tax increases instead of looking at those bigger options like the wealth tax or the payroll tax that we were talking about. And they are putting the tax burden on high-earning businesses, not so much, wealthy individuals. But this is after a lot of Democrats were messaging since the start of session that wealthy individuals need to pay their fair share, right?
Yeah.
We saw that even before the session started. Are Democrats changing their tune on this?
No, not completely. I think that they are what they're doing here is taking off the table some new taxes, novel taxes. The wealth tax has never been tried in any U.S. state. It's been repealed in some countries that tried it. And so they're saying, look, we're going to turn to the tried and true taxes that we know are legal, and we're going to turn the dials on them, and we're going to adjust them in a way around the edges, at least, that can make them more progressive. Within the existing tax structure, they're trying to turn the dials in a way that they can argue is progressive, not as progressive as some of the progressives and the unions want. But, they've had to make trade-offs, too. I think the Senate budget originally said we're going to, in addition to doing the wealth tax, the payroll tax, we're going to cut the sales tax by half a penny, which is a substantial cut. I think the state sales tax rate is 6.5 cents or something. And so they were going to cut that by half a penny. They had to drop that in this latest proposal. So that's a less progressive option that they've put out there now.
Jeanie, I want to ask, so I'm thinking about Governor Bob Ferguson right now because he asked legislators to look for cuts before trying to raise revenue. And Democrats have $12 billion in new revenue in this proposal. Is he happy? Is he unhappy? Is there any word from Governor Ferguson?
That's the question of the hour, Scott. I too was thinking about Governor Bob Ferguson as these revenue proposals came out.
We're all thinking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Imagine that. So yeah, we, and I say we, like the press corps. A bunch of us have reached out to the governor's office. we've been told that he'll be releasing a statement as of the time we're having this conversation on Thursday morning. Still have not seen that statement. So we are expecting to get some news. Don't know the length of the statement. Don't know the extent of the statement, but he'll say something, allegedly. So we'll see.
Yeah. He hasn't been a holder of press conferences to explain his views very much, as we've written about. So he's being very careful on this, I think. I do think, the governor he doesn't have to come out and say, I'm going to veto this whole thing or, scrap it and start over. The legislature wants to finish on time. I think there's an argument that the longer they stay in session, the more the budget situation could change on the federal level with everything coming from Trump. So there's a real incentive for them to finish on time in a week or two. And the governor then can take the final product, and he has line item veto. He can go through it, and he could presumably make a bunch of tweaks that might, enrage people, but he does have that power. So it could be that they put some things on his plate, and then he has to own, the final product in that way.
Yeah. The other people I'm thinking about right now are the Republicans. What are they saying? And do they have any leverage here?
I mean, Republicans, have continued to say, that it's not a revenue problem, it's a spending problem. That's been a long-standing view of Republicans. I think I have a placard in my office from 2016 that actually has that exact phrase on it. And so they're opposed to tax increases. They've, Senate Republicans came out with a budget of their own, I think last month, and they have pointed to that repeatedly because it doesn't include taxes. It also doesn't include the collectively bargained raises for state workers and a bunch of other things that have been promised in previous years. But they have been adamant about not including any new taxes. They say taxes on businesses will drive away jobs. They say that, taxes on property are regressive. I mean, the property tax system in Washington state is regressive in the fact that the constraints, like you pointed out, do fall more poignantly on lower income people. And so, they have also criticized Democrats talking about, trying to be progressive in their revenue proposals, but also still including some of these things that are not progressive. So they're really opposed to that. As far as their leverage, I mean, they have all kinds of tactics procedurally to slow things up. I mean, we're coming down into the final days of the legislative session. Like we've said, they're really wanting to get out on time. Everybody, I think, in Olympia wants them to finish on time. But I think Republicans, because they are in the minority, the tools that they have are public pushback and trying to rally their, constituents and people who are opposed to these things to really, make a lot of calls to their Democratic representatives and senators. But also they can take many procedural steps to, maybe slow things down and cause some delays or try and propose different amendments. The other thing, too, is, they have a friend in the governor's office more so now than they have for years. Inslee was not a Republican, not a Republican, wasn't having regular meetings with them, to say the least. So I think that that's another avenue that they've been trying to find some leverage in is, they've been having regular meetings with Governor Ferguson. So I think they're also hopeful that the relationship that they've been trying to establish and that the governor has been establishing with them can potentially bring in some, no thank yous to some taxes. But it remains to be seen.
And one other point of leverage isn't necessarily legislative, but they've tried this in the past, and there's talk of initiatives that they could file to try to beat back some of that or change the taxes. I think there's one to try to even lower, as the legislature is talking about raising the property tax cap. I think there's some initiatives that are being floated by Brian Haywood and others to lower the cap. Mm-hmm. So and it's almost like saying, if you guys try to do this, we're going to try to galvanize this anti-tax sentiment and really put you in a bind on taxes. Say you really cannot raise property taxes, for example.
When we started talking about taxes today, I kind of thought that this is more a technical question than a philosophical one here, especially when it comes to the divide. Like, Ferguson doesn't hate a wealth tax philosophically. He just wants to see if it'll stand up in court before he balances any part of the budget on it. At least that's what he says. But when I think about, like, I'm going back to that crosswalk AI, Jeff Bezos we heard at the beginning. And when I listen to some people, have this discussion, I think there is actually maybe a philosophical disagreement here about the stakes. Washington has been something of a tax haven for rich people. Some Democrats don't want to tax them so much that they leave and take all their tax revenue with them. Other people, though, like whoever hacked that crosswalk sign, I don't know if it was a Democrat, right? But whoever it was, they seem to be saying, who cares if they leave? The quote from the crosswalk was, then normal people could afford to live here again. And I've heard that sentiment before, and I'm curious what both of you think about that.
Yeah, you had when Seattle was in the throes of the debate about the tax on big businesses and Amazon. That came after years of really expensive, increases in housing costs and rents, and so you have heard that sentiment for a while in Seattle. Like, maybe it's fine if some of the jobs move to Bellevue or even out of state, but if you're running the state economy or the budget and you're looking at, if we pass a tax, but the people who pay it leave, and these rich people are very able to change their residence or find some other tax shelter or something to avoid paying it, they have to balance those real world calculations with their sort of more utopian ideal about what our tax system should look like.
Jeannie, any final thoughts?
Well, and there are a number of, and we've talked about them previously, but there are a number of legal constraints too. So to Jim's point, I mean, if all of the wealthy people that are being targeted by these new tax increases targeting wealthy people, they leave, and then all the money has to come from everybody else. That sort of just leaves us back, I don't know, in square one maybe. I also don't know if this is something that is just restricted to the Democrats' party. I mean, one thing that I noticed at this anti-tax rally on the Capitol this week, there were like 2 signs that I saw that said, tax the rich, not our homes, or, Bob Ferguson says no to a wealth tax, but yes to our wallets. So I'm curious to see how the sentiment of taxing the rich starts to percolate more on the conservative or Republican side of things, because there are signals that that's starting to happen. So I'm curious about that. That's something that I think about, is like the Democrats have a clear, wing or sector of their party that it's maybe more broadly accepted in the Democrats to say something like tax the rich. I'm curious to see how and when or if that really starts to percolate on the conservative side too.
I mean, on the national level, you've seen some sort of MAGA pundits, I think Steve Bannon and others, they're like, tax the rich on the national level. And, if Donald Trump suddenly came out for taxing the rich, I bet a lot of the Republicans would follow right along here, because that's been their pattern.
I was literally this morning just reading a story where Senator Kevin Kramer, this is an NBC, Senator Kevin Kramer, a Republican of North Dakota, said, it's just so fun to be a Republican these days, just to watch the transformation where suddenly people are going, when you think about it, why do we worry so much about that? So whether it's allowing them to go up a little bit or even lowering some of the other stuff more, there's a populism growing in the party, even among those of us with powdered wigs.
Wow.
And that is a good point to end on. Taxing the rich, maybe more of a populist thing than a Democrat thing in the future. Jeanie, Lindsay, you're KUOW's Olympia reporter, and Jim Brunner, you cover politics for the Seattle Times. Thank you both.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's it for Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone. Today's show was produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Gabe Spitzer. And this show is only possible through donations from our listeners. You can visit KUOW.org/politics to donate and keep our podcast and others like it going.